Greg Medcraft, Chairman of ASIC, Chairman of IOSCO. Trust is still in short supply in capital markets. Why do you think that is?
Oh look, I think we're coming out of the crisis the last 5 years. I think that trust was, was damaged after the crisis. And clearly I think we're still rebuilding trust in markets.
And we're rebuilding trust, but is the reason for people to be reticent to return to those markets warranted, do you think?
Look, I think, in fact, people are returning to the markets at the moment. What we're seeing around the world, particularly as we speak, is that actually spreads around the world are diminishing dramatically. But I think, unfortunately, for good or for bad, because we're in a low interest rate environment, I think we're actually seeing investors returning to markets in droves, basically because of the search for yield. So I think whether it's increasing confidence or it's search for yield, I'm not sure which one it is, but it is happening at the moment.
So we could be sleepwalking into potentially another crisis?
Well, I guess it's a case of what we don't know, we don't know. I mean, we've taken all these actions to try and avoid another systemic crisis, but I guess we've just got to be a little careful that even some of the actions we've taken from solving this crisis don't create the basis of the next crisis. So, but I do think that one of the things I think we probably need to focus on a lot more is culture and governance. I think that we haven't really focused heavily on culture and governance, I think, and I think that's one that is the one that people are going to be focused on a lot more in the coming years.
And why is that? Is it because it's too difficult? Is it too nebulous a concept?
I think it's quite interesting. I think what we're all realising, and this is not rocket science, is actually what drives people's behaviour. And we're seeing this in retail investor protection now. There's a lot of talk about using behavioural insights to how you should actually shape regulation. Equally, I think in terms of, say, corporate governance, people are thinking about, well, what drives certain behaviour? It's just common sense. It's your human beings, and culture is actually what drives people to behave. And I think when we look at some of the issues that occurred, just analysing some of the root causes of the financial crisis, conflicts of interest, lack of skin in the game. Most of that comes back to essentially, basically the wrong culture in an organisation. I think, that's why I think when we look at perhaps regulation that's come out, I think fundamentally what people are now saying is you've got to think about what is driving that behaviour, and generally what's driving it is the culture of an organisation. And I think even if we look at things like what's happened with the manipulation of benchmarks, the LIBOR or the foreign exchange, in banks, many banks, it was just seen as that's just how you do things, right? The culture was not right.
And interestingly, that culture continued long after the global financial crisis, long after these banks were bailed out.
Yeah.
So ultimately, whose responsibility is it to transform that culture? Is it the responsibility of the board of directors, or is it ultimately, as Mark Carney seemed to imply in London in May, that potentially it might be actually the responsibility of regulators?
No, I don't think you regulate a changing culture. I think the changing culture has got to come from the top, from the board and from the Chief Executive Officer. Now, in Australia, where I am, I look at, say, our big financial institutions, and, I look at the relative culture of each of them. They're very different in terms of what I'd say is their level of compliance culture within the one financial system. So I think, and it generally starts at the very top, at the board. The board sets the tone of the culture, and the CEO. The CEO and the board set the tone. And I think that goes the way down. And you can cite examples of banks which have really great culture. It's about, it's not so much about complying strictly with the law, it's actually just, frankly, making sure that you actually pass the perception test, that actually it's just the right thing to do with how you run your business. And I think they've got to have more of that. You've got to think of that front page test. How would it look if this became public? I mean, that comes to, whether it be who you sell your financial products to, how you're involved in setting benchmark rates. I know recently there was a case where I had a chief executive call me and they said, oh, what we've seen looking at some of the information exchanges is appalling, and he said, I'm just not going to tolerate that. And that's a great reaction. It was not about not complying. There's no legal issue. It was a cultural issue. And the chief executive said to me, I'm going to deal with this because that's not the way we want the culture in our bank to operate. And I think that is great. We need more of that, actually. But we're not going to change it by law. It's a bit like in financial advisors. In Australia, for example, I've always said is that what has to happen is you've got to change the culture, because you're not going to regulate a change in mind. You might move the dial a little bit, but what you've got to do, if you want to get sustainable long-term change, is you actually have to change the culture.
Well, we did have a situation in Australia where you had Commonwealth Bank of Australia found that there was mismanagement of financial planners. As a consequence, basically, it agreed to enter into an enforceable undertaking with ASIC itself, and then decided, well, we're not just going to fulfil the terms of that enforceable undertaking.
I think that was a good example of culture.
And bad culture.
I think it was an issue of culture and actually it was clearly an issue of culture of, below the top management and a need for change. And I believe in that case, I think the top management of the Commonwealth Bank are very different, and I think my view is that they're wanting to get that culture right, frankly, and they've been very cooperative. So at the top, and I think there has been an issue. Unfortunately, it takes time for a cultural change to filter down, right? And I think they're still in that transition.
And can we rely then on the stated willingness of major financial institutions that they are recognising the need to change? Can we just rely on self-certification, or does there have to be more?
Look, I think, no, I think you've got to do more than that. I think one of the things I think is a good idea is to do stakeholder surveys, because I think, for example, coming and talking to the regulators as part of a stakeholder survey to see what they think is a damn good idea, to see what they think is your culture. Because I'm sure that, for example, some of the people that we regulate, I'd probably give a 4 out of 10, and others I'd give an 8 out of 10. And the one who has 4 out of 10 probably thinks they do a good job, whereas their perception from a regulated perspective is they do a pretty average job to a poor job. And so I think often self-assessment doesn't necessarily do it. I think you've got to. I think the good practice there, if you want to make sure your culture's right, is to actually ask the stakeholders. It might not just be regulators. It might be your customers. It might be. And it's actually a bit like getting a 360-degree review if you're an employee, right? Often when you do a 360-degree review, you do your own self-assessment, but then somebody else does it, and you actually find a gap. And I think that's a very good way of seeing there's your view of yourself and there's what everyone else thinks of you. And sometimes that's the best way of really identifying if there actually is a problem. And I think that actually is a pretty good technique, frankly.
Right. And to what extent then can one make that information public in terms of your rating of somebody's risk profile as 4 rather than 8? That is actually quite a difficult one. I guess that if I would say that again, it depends on companies. But if I was running a company, we publish our stakeholder survey at ASIC. Right, it goes online. Warts and all. Here's what people think of us. But I think it's probably a healthy thing, actually, to actually publish it and go, well, here's what our customers think of us. Here's what our regulators think of us. That's not a bad accountability and transparency mechanism, frankly. We've had a global system, I suppose, a global worldview informed by the efficient market hypothesis, the effectiveness of market ordering. That worldview has been fundamentally challenged by the global financial crisis.
Oh, I think it's outdated.
It's outdated?
I think it's completely outdated. I think fundamentally, I'm a big believer in behavioural economics. And I'm a new convert to behavioural economics. But I just think so much we need to think about why people do things. And not everyone's rational. They're driven by emotions. And I think we need to think more about, it's again back to that cultural thing. You know, we've got to think, we're people. So we've got to think about behavioural insights.
So if we're going
what drives company and people to do things? And then how do we, you know, if we're getting behaviours that are not consistent with what we're trying to achieve, you know, what sort of nudges do we put in place to make sure that we get the right behaviour? I think that's the right approach.
So ultimately then...
So I'm actually a big believer in behavioural economics,
right.
frankly.
So ultimately, in a
I believe the market works, but it's about how you put the right nudges in place to make sure the market achieves the outcomes that you want it to achieve.
But for you to achieve those outcomes, you have to clearly define purpose.
Correct.
Okay, so what ultimately could or should the purpose of the capital markets be?
Right, well, I think the capital markets is there to serve the real economy. So basically, and I think we don't ask enough often about why financial regulation exists. Well, my view about the why it exists in capital markets is to enable basically capital to be formed by, you know, accessing investors, and so that issuers who want to access capital can access it. That's what markets are about, right? It's having end investors and end issuers. And then in the middle are the gatekeepers who facilitate the system. But basically, they don't have jobs if the people on either side here are not providing money and then accessing the capital market. So if this doesn't work, then the system doesn't work, and therefore what we don't have is capital to fund economic growth. And then that ends up with effects on living standards, etc. So it's very critical what we do. At the end of the day, it's about basically the well-being of countries in terms of actually funding their economies.
So that suggests then that market participants have duties and responsibilities as well as rights.
Well, I wouldn't put it like that. What I'd say is that they won't have jobs if the markets don't operate properly. So they actually have an inbuilt economic interest in making sure that those investors and those issuers feel confident to participate in that market. Now, if, for example, you're a high-frequency trader, you might bring some efficiencies to that market, which are good, but it can't get so far out of hand that you start affecting how confident these people feel about this market. Because then they go, well, okay, we're not going to actually participate in this market. And then basically it's no longer serving the real economy. So I think having balance is very important, frankly. So it's not, you know, at the end of the day, you know, if you want it's a free market approach. It's like, it ain't going to work if people actually are not confident in participating in it, whether they be, you know, investors or issuers. That's fundamental. So, and that's what we do. As market regulators, we're not like prudential regulators who are there often, you know, they're there to protect depositors' money. We're not there for that. We're actually there to make sure that the markets actually work. And the way markets work is that people are confident and want to be confident that they can invest in it, in the market, and that the issuers and the investors are confident that it's free, orderly, and it's transparent. They're the fundamental premises of markets, right? But we need to think about the higher reason of why they actually exist, and that's the why they exist. It's the why.
And we've traditionally used disclosure as the primary tool. Have we reached the limits of disclosure as a regulatory tool, do you think?
Well, look, you know, disclosure is a great tool. It itself is a good tool, but the context of disclosure is that it should be clear, concise, and effective. Now, I think we've done a lot of work on the clear and the concise. I think we've missed on an effective. I think that is one that we're completely failing on. So disclosure is a tool, and conduct are two very critical tools in making sure how markets work, right? But I think we've got to focus on the effective. And what, again, comes back to behavioural insights, is that why is it not effective? Well, generally it's not effective these days is because it's become too cumbersome. It's not easy to access. And I think we need to think about that. And we need to make sure that the law keeps up with the opportunities. And I think there's great opportunities that come out of, for example, social media. I think you've got to think about making sure that Disclosure can be multi-layered, so if you're somebody who really just wants all the detail in 2 pages, we want the highlights, what all the key risks are, then you should have that level of detail and you should be able to unfold the level you want, right? And equally, how you access that information should be multi-channeled. It should be, you should be able to go to a YouTube video, and if that's how effectively you can get the information to you, or it's a PowerPoint, I can deliver it to you on your smartphone. I think with the opportunities with technology, we've got great opportunities to make it much more effective. And effective is what it's got about. If you want to have, confident and informed investors, then they've got to have effective disclosure, that they are actually buying products they understand.
And does that also mean that the regulator has a responsibility to perhaps intervene, to nudge financial market participants in questions of the design of products that come to market in the first place?
Look, I think my approach to this would be more about saying to product manufacturers to start with, to say, look, at the end of the day, and I think this is the case as a former product manufacturer, you actually don't want somebody who doesn't know what they're buying to buy your product. I can tell you, it's not a long-term sustainable strategy. So I would take a market approach, which is encouraging them to think about this fact. And actually what we're seeing already in the world is that if you sell an investor a product they have no idea what they're buying, you can't, the courts are actually saying to investment bankers, as we've seen with the case decision in Australia with the CDOs, that basically if they buy a product they don't understand, often the legislature or the courts will eventually catch up with you and say, we don't care what you say, they shouldn't have ever been allowed to be offered that product. So it's probably not a sustainable business approach, business model to actually offer products that people don't understand, whether it's through the product manufacturer or distributor, because it'll eventually catch up with you or your reputation. So first of all, I think that's important. Equally, I think that there is a lot of debate whether if that doesn't happen, whether regulators should be able to intervene and say, look, you just can't offer that product. But I'd rather start with I think that is a useful power to have as a reserve power, but I think at the same time it should be, the first step should be to be saying to manufacturers and distributors, it's not sustainable from your own market perspective to do this because you'll get caught out. It'll end up costing you money. And I think that's important. And I think we're seeing a change now around the world. The one thing that's come out of the crisis is what we saw around the world is, for example, the CDO market. We saw it in Hong Kong, we saw it in Belgium, we saw it in Singapore, where governments said, these investors should have never been sold these products, you're going to have to compensate them. So essentially, the message is there very closely to manufacturers and distributors. You've got to take responsibility here.
You've made the reform of benchmarks critical to your stewardship of IOSCO. We've now seen market conduct regulators, if not being supplanted, then certainly being joined in action by competition regulators. And competition regulators are not dealing with as individual investigations into individual firms, they're looking at this holistically. And what the European Union competition regulator is saying, well, in actual fact, this is not just a casino, it's a rigged casino.
I think one of the issues that is emerging on benchmarks is collusion, if that's what you're saying, which is a competition issue. And I think that's going to be the one that is going to be interesting to see that playing out in the coming months and weeks, actually. Weeks and months, yeah.
So as you prepare to
I think the collusion one is the elephant in the room at the moment, to be honest with you, yeah. But I think it's only just starting to emerge that there is collusion issues here. Yeah.
And so what we're talking about is not just, small fines.
And if it gets to anti-competition, talking very large amounts.
You're talking, and is that actually going to be the key incentive to change behaviour, do you think?
Money normally changes behaviour, yeah.
Greg Medcraft, thank you very much.
Thanks, Justin.